Hello everyone, my name is Hilary Villa and I'm taking a Mexican art history class at Fullerton Community College. Today I'm going to be talking about the Zapatista dolls that are sold and produced in Chiapas, Mexico, and the analysis and meaning behind them. First off, a little bit about me. My entire life I've gone to Calvary La Habra Church in Orange County. For the past 4 years, I've been an intern and worked full-time there. Several times, I have gone to... During that time, we got to go to San Cristobal de las Casas, and I got to see the birthplace of the 1994 rebellion of the Zapatistas. In this video essay, I will be covering just that. The Zapatista dolls that are sold in the San Cristobal marketplace by little children and their families. The British Museum is one of the few that has these Zapatista dolls standing alone on display. In the archives, the curator comments, quote, "After January 1st, 1994, and the uprising in Chiapas led by Subcomandante Marcos, the Social of San Juan Chumala began to make these dolls for sale to visitors to the area. The doll is a female follower of Zapatista that was bought from a child in Palenque on November 9th, 1994. Now, what exactly are Zapatistas? They are a group of indigenous activists from Chiapas that fight for land reform, advocacy for indigenous groups, and fight against capitalism and globalization. One form of globalization that they fight against is the NAFTA agreement. This agreement eliminates any taxes or tariffs put upon trade between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., as well as welcoming tourism. The Zapatista activist group formed in 1983 and over the course of 10 years grew to 1,300 armed members. As political unrest grew due to the cancellation of Article 17 and therefore land reform, the Zapatistas declared war on the Mexican government in 1994, the same day NAFTA came to be. Over the next 8 years, there were many deaths and assassinations. All the violence finally stopped in 2001 when the Zapatistas arrived in Mexico City for peace agreements. Despite this, the animosity between the Mexican government and the Zapatistas is still alive and well. Despite the Zapatista rebels living isolated in communes, the issues that they were fighting for still remain today. For example, an article from the Atlantic writes, "NAFTA's impact on Mexico has long been a subject of debate. For many, it represents the two Mexicos, one increasingly industrialized and affluent, the other largely rural and impoverished, and the gap widening between them. Down in Chiapas, the effects really show." The same article writing, "The removal of tariffs and subsidies on agriculture, notably corn, caused massive job losses in the country's rural south, prompting both migration and social unrest. According to Mexico's official statistics agency, while 60% of the population of Nuevo Leon, the country's wealthiest state per capita, which borders Texas, are middle class, 80% of those living in Chiapas dwell in poverty. In addition to the growing poverty rate, the land reform that has yet to be fixed is still a concern." A book titled Basta, Land and the Zapatista Rebellion in Chiapas writes, quote, "In Chiapas, where many land claims have yet to be resolved after languishing in the state bureaucracy for years, the repeal of land reform legislation robbed many peasants not just of the possibility of gaining a piece of land, but quite simply of hope. Subcomandante Marcos, in an interview published by Tiempo, indicated that the change in Article 27 was the straw that broke the camel's back in persuading Zapatistas to take arms. Subcomandante Marcos was the rebel group's military leader who was their spokesman in 1994 at the beginning of the rebellion. Although he's not Mayan himself, he fights for the indigenous people's rights. Although Marcos was quite influential in the Zapatista group, Emiliano Zapata was the group's namesake, being an accomplished guerrilla leader during the Mexican Revolution and a fundamental advocate for land reform. One of his most famous quotes being, "I would rather die standing than live on my knees." Now on to the Zapatista dolls. The dolls are traditionally made of wood, wool, and cotton. The faces of the dolls being covered by face masks, just as the rebels would have. Normally sporting a gun in their hands, with most of their bodies being covered in rough wool fabric, displaying the poverty of the Zapatista rebels. Their feet are normally woven and wrapped in colorful fabric. Some are sported in white clothing while some are in black, showing different ranks. The lack of uniformity in these dolls show how handmade they are. The one that I own stands at only 4 inches tall and is connected to a keychain. These dolls sport the typical uniform of any of the rebels. By making these for tourists, the Zapatistas are partially contributing to the tourism that they are traditionally against. However, Chiapas' poverty contributes to tourism being their number one income. These rebels being against NAFTA aren't the only people that are against it. Farmers, for one, are very against it due to tariffs and subsidies on agriculture and the chemicals that are imported with various pesticides on them. In an article titled Perspectivas Locales, the author writes, quote, "At the international level, trade agreements such as NAFTA should be rewritten in order to prevent the current massive inflow of U.S. corn, soy, meat, and dairy products into Mexico. No trade agreement will ever be symmetrical in nature. However, the current dumping that occurs under NAFTA is a result of U.S. subsidies in corn and other grains that can no longer be tolerated." As you can see, the issues with NAFTA is not isolated to the Zapatistas. Despite the large groups of civil unrest outside of the Zapatistas, they still became a focal point for anti-government feelings. An artist named Gallo sculpted a hammer made entirely of Zapatista dolls to represent the power of the rebellion. All of this chaos had interesting effects on the artist community. A book titled New Tendencies in Mexican Art, the 1990s, states, quote, "How did artists respond to the traumatic events that marked the decade of the 1990s? One would expect art produced in this period to reflect the turbulence, chaos, and social unrest of a country on the brink of collapse. One would expect an art full of references to political intrigue, Chiapas, the Zapatistas, the PRI's unraveling. One would expect an enraged art done with a sense of urgency. The reality, however, is more complicated. Most art produced during Salinas' presidency was entirely apolitical. This resulted in the birth of neo-Mexicanists, who included more traditional Mexican images in their art that, for the most part, strayed away from political references. Despite the surprising lack of progress can be made from this rebellion. For one, a journal article from NACLA states, "For many sectors of Mexican society, the Zapatistas represented the voice of the voiceless and inspired a new sense of hope for Mexico's poor and indigenous citizens after decades of desperation." I hope that you found this interesting and that this inspires you to look into things that you're curious about and just know more about history. Thanks for watching.